My parents promised to pay for my wedding, then spent everything on my sister's divorce and called me selfish for moving forward. Half a year ago, when I got engaged, my parents assured me that they would handle the expenses for my wedding. However, about 3 weeks ago, they informed me that they could no longer follow through with that commitment. The reason? My 36-year-old sister had recently decided to get a divorce, and they had spent most of their money assisting her with legal costs. To give some background, I am 34 years old, and my fiancé, also 34, and I have been together for 3 years. When he proposed, I was beyond excited and shared the news with my family that very day. From the beginning, my fiancé and I planned to pay for the wedding ourselves, and we were perfectly fine with that arrangement. But my parents were so overjoyed about our engagement that they insisted on covering the costs. Initially, I was hesitant, but they eventually convinced me to let them at least pay for half. That compromise made me feel less guilty about accepting their help. Since they were contributing, my fiancé and I decided we could expand our wedding plans slightly, beyond what we had originally budgeted for. Then, out of nowhere, they told me they could no longer provide financial support because they had already spent a huge portion of their funds on my sister's attorney for her divorce case. A few years ago, my parents both retired and began running a small bookstore together. They are financially secure, not wealthy, but also not struggling. That's why I don't understand why they felt the need to take full responsibility for my sister's legal fees. They willingly chose to hire one of the most expensive divorce lawyers in town, fully aware of the enormous cost. Despite making a promise to support my wedding just a month before my sister filed for divorce, they still went ahead with this decision, knowing it would affect their ability to contribute. Apparently, my sister had been dealing with serious issues in her marriage long before I got engaged, but no one in the family was aware of it. Then, about a month after I announced my engagement, she and her husband had yet another intense argument. That fight led her to finally leave him and move back in with our parents. Since she had quit working a year before, my parents felt obligated to cover the costs of her divorce. She had been with her husband for 8 years, married for 6, and feared he would take everything from her since they never had a prenuptial agreement. Because of that fear, my parents insisted on hiring the best legal representation they could find. This has ended up being incredibly expensive. The divorce process is still ongoing, and the settlement negotiations are nowhere near finished. So my parents continue to pour money into legal fees. When I asked about the financial support they had promised for my wedding, they finally admitted that they couldn't afford to help anymore. Since my engagement, I had been relying on their word. They had plenty of opportunities to inform me earlier that they were choosing to prioritize my sister's situation instead. If they had told me right away, I might have been disappointed, but I would have understood, and it wouldn't have been a major issue. Instead, they waited until just a few weeks ago, after I had already planned everything, booked vendors, and made non-refundable payments for the venue. Most of the payments I had already made were non-refundable, so I had no option but to go ahead with the wedding as planned. This whole time, I had believed that my only financial responsibility was paying for my share of the expenses, while my parents would handle the rest, just as they had promised. Since they kept reassuring me that they would cover half the costs, I planned everything based on that agreement. Then, out of nowhere, they suddenly informed me that they wouldn't be able to contribute after all. For months, they had misled me, continuously promising they would take care of their part, even though they knew they wouldn't be able to follow through. I confronted them about it 3 weeks ago when my fiancé and I visited them while my sister was away. The reason for our visit was to ask when they would be transferring the money they had committed to, since we needed to settle the remaining payments soon. With the wedding coming up fast, we didn't want to deal with financial issues at the last minute or have to handle outstanding balances after the event when we would already be busy with other things. Since everything was already arranged, we wanted to finalize the payments to avoid any unnecessary stress later. That's when my parents finally admitted that they didn't think it was wise to spend any more money because they had already spent so much on my sister's divorce, trying to make sure she didn't lose anything. The moment they said this, I completely lost my temper. Planning the wedding had already been stressful, and this was the last thing I needed to hear. They had thrown off all my financial planning, and I had every right to be angry. To make things even worse, they had the nerve to put the blame on me, claiming that I hadn't planned properly and that I was trying to have a wedding that was beyond my financial capacity. Just to be clear, when my fiancé and I first started planning, we intended to pay for the entire wedding ourselves and were planning something small and affordable. It was only because my parents insisted on covering half of the expenses that we decided to expand our plans a little. Even with the adjustments, our wedding was still not over the top or unnecessarily expensive. It wasn't about whether we could afford it. It was about the fact that my parents had given me their word, and I had planned accordingly. If my fiancé and I had been paying for everything from the start, we would have happily stuck with our smaller wedding. Even though we still had enough money to cover the wedding on our own, their sudden change of heart completely messed up my plans. And for them to then turn around and accuse me of not managing my budget properly, when they were the ones who led me to believe they would handle half the costs, was nothing but manipulation. They knew this wasn't my fault, yet they tried to twist the situation and put the blame on me. I wasn't going to accept that. This led to a huge argument, and then they started using guilt to try to control me. They told me that it was already hard enough for my sister to be going through a divorce, and I was being inconsiderate by planning a wedding while she was struggling. According to them, I shouldn't even be getting married right now because my sister was having such a difficult time, and the family's focus should be on supporting her rather than me throwing my happiness in her face. They even suggested that I postpone my wedding so my fragile sister wouldn't feel emotionally overwhelmed. The whole thing was completely ridiculous. They acted as if my wedding was some kind of attack on my sister, as if I was supposed to put my life on hold just because she was dealing with her personal issues. They completely ignored the fact that I had spent months planning and had already paid for several things that I couldn't get refunded. I was already furious about everything they had done, and this just made things so much worse. In the end, my fiancé and I left, and the conversation ended on a really bad note. After that, I stopped talking to my parents altogether. For a long time, I kept trying to find reasons to explain why my parents didn't send the money they had promised, which we needed to complete the last few wedding payments. But once my fiancé and I found out the truth, we realized there was no point in talking to them anymore. Just to be clear, this was never about the money. It was about them making a promise and then breaking it. On top of that, they tried to shift the blame onto me, making it seem like I had not planned well, when in reality, they were the ones who failed to prepare. They also made me feel like a bad person, just because I wanted to get married while my sister was going through a divorce. Honestly, I don't even think their reasoning makes sense. From what I understand, my sister had been unhappy in her marriage for a long time, so her divorce shouldn't have come as a huge shock. Meanwhile, my fiancé and I had always been clear about wanting to get married. The only reason we waited was because his father had serious health problems. As soon as his condition improved, we got engaged. Otherwise, we had planned to get married last year, and both of our families knew this. If my parents had truly planned to help with the wedding, they should have been prepared. And if they realized they couldn't afford it, they should have told me instead of keeping quiet and acting as if everything was fine. I know I have every right to feel upset, but for some reason, my parents refuse to see that they did anything wrong. Instead, they are acting as if I'm the one to blame. Since our argument, we haven't spoken. A few days ago, my fiancé and I finally sent out the wedding invitations. Like I mentioned earlier, the two of us make enough money to afford the wedding on our own, but we had counted on some financial help from my parents. Once we understood that wasn't happening, we covered the remaining costs ourselves and made sure everything was set. With the wedding only a few weeks away and our honeymoon happening right after, we wanted to finish everything in advance. When we sent out the invitations, we made the choice not to invite my parents. After everything they had done, I didn't want them at the wedding because their presence would only make things tense and uncomfortable. I thought they would have expected this, especially since they never once reached out to apologize after our argument. They didn't even check on me or try to have a conversation. While I can understand why my sister didn't reach out, since she wasn't directly involved and had her own problems, I expected better from my parents. They had been excited about the wedding and involved in planning it from the beginning, but as soon as things got complicated, they completely pulled away instead of trying to fix things. The fact that they never acknowledged their actions, let alone apologized, showed me that they didn't think they had done anything wrong. If they had made an effort to reach out, I might have been willing to work things out. But since they stayed silent, I was left feeling incredibly hurt. That's why I ultimately decided not to invite them to the wedding. My fiancé and his family also agreed that this was the right thing to do because my parents had made it clear they didn't care. I honestly didn't think they would be upset about not being invited. But once they realized that other relatives had received invitations, and they hadn't, they called me. When we spoke, they sounded very hurt, but I was completely honest with them. I told them that their actions had deeply affected me. Even if I could look past the fact that they made me feel guilty for getting married while my sister was divorcing, and even if I could forgive them for lying to me for months about paying for part of the wedding, I couldn't ignore the fact that they made no effort to make things right after our argument. In the end, I did what I felt was best. I left them out of the wedding. This day is supposed to be one of the happiest moments of my life, and right now, my relationship with them only brings me sadness, not happiness. At that moment, my parents started defending their choices, insisting that I was being unfair. They gave several reasons they believed justified their actions, and now I'm left feeling unsure about how to process everything. First, They explained that they didn't tell me earlier about not being able to help with my wedding because they were already covering my sister's legal expenses. They hadn't realized that hiring a lawyer would be so expensive, nor did they expect the divorce process to take so long. It has been nearly 5 months, and there is still no final agreement on what she wants. The case even ended up in family court, and although it will eventually be settled, that won't happen for a few more months. I have no idea why everything is taking so long because, honestly, I don't know the details. What I do know is that they are still discussing things like financial support, dividing assets, and settlements. Even with that in mind, I don't understand why it's dragging on for so long. And if this process is costing so much money, I don't see why my sister isn't contributing anything. She only left her job a year ago, and I know for a fact that she has some savings. But my parents think she should keep that money for herself. Since she is still searching for a new job and plans to move out once she finds steady work, they believe she needs to save as much as possible. That's why they chose to pay for everything themselves, and they expected me to accept it. The second thing they told me was that once they realized they couldn't afford to help with the wedding, they felt embarrassed. At first, they tried to gather some money, but later decided against it. Their reason was that they were getting older, and it wasn't the right time for them to be spending large amounts. They also knew I had enough money to pay for the wedding on my own, and that my fiancé would be there to support me, so they assumed it wouldn't be a big deal. They thought I would simply understand and move on. When I didn't, they were surprised, which is why they tried to twist the situation and make it seem like I was in the wrong. They even admitted this and apologized, but they still expected me to be mature about it and see things from their point of view. They told me that, in the end, family is the only thing that truly matters, and if they couldn't count on me to be understanding, then maybe they hadn't raised me to be the person they thought I was. That statement really stayed with me, making me wonder if I'd been too focused on money instead of the bigger picture. Maybe deciding not to invite them to my wedding was too harsh, but even now, part of me is still angry. Not just because they went back on their word, but also because they lied to me, tried to manipulate me, and never gave a sincere apology. Right now, I feel completely stuck between these two emotions, and I don't know which one to listen to. So for the time being, I'm standing by my decision not to invite them since they chose to break their promise. Update. A few days have passed since I last spoke to my parents. During our conversation, I told them I needed time to think before making a final choice. Over the past few days, all I've realized is that overthinking everything is making me even more frustrated. Honestly, this isn't as black and white as I initially thought, and judging by many of the comments I've seen, a lot of people seem to feel the same way. When I spoke to my fiancé about this, he made it clear that the final decision about whether or not to invite my family to the wedding was entirely up to me. However, he advised me to completely step away from the situation for a while and then reconsider with a clear and relaxed mindset. Some people have asked why my fiancé's parents didn't step in to help pay for the wedding. The explanation is simple. His father has been dealing with ongoing health problems for several years, so they always need to keep extra funds available for medical emergencies. Personally, I never expected them to contribute financially. As I've mentioned before, my fiancé and I were fully capable of covering the costs ourselves. The only reason we assumed my parents would help was because they had specifically assured us they would. Coming back to my parents, I decided to contact them once more to tell them that I was still struggling with what to do. I explained that, despite what they believed, the situation wasn't as easy for me as it seemed, especially after we had gone 3 whole weeks without speaking. That period of complete silence made all the difference. It was what really affected me. Their lack of communication is what prevented me from simply moving on and forgiving them. They never said sorry, and by the time they finally did, it no longer mattered. They didn't reply to my message, but that's fine. It only gives me more time to reflect on what I truly want. Right now, my main focus is finishing up my wedding preparations and staying on top of my work obligations since I still have a lot to take care of before I leave for both the wedding and honeymoon. Second update. 2 days ago, I shared that I hadn't yet made up my mind about whether I wanted my parents and sister at my wedding. Well, that decision has now been made much easier for me. They chose not to come. They felt that being left uncertain like this was both insulting and humiliating. Earlier today, my sister sent me a message apologizing for all the stress I was experiencing so close to my wedding. However, she followed that by saying that since I wasn't thoughtful enough to delay my wedding, even though I knew she was going through a painful divorce, she and my parents had no reason to be considerate toward me either. The first part of her message was basically an extended complaint about how inconsiderate I was for frequently bringing up my wedding around our parents and making plans in front of her, even though I knew she was having a tough time with her divorce. She accused me of being intentionally unkind, saying that I had done it just to show off my happiness at her expense. She even went as far as to call me cruel for supposedly parading my wedding around while she was facing one of the most difficult moments of her life. Just to set the record straight, I had made a huge effort over the past 5 months to be as mindful of her situation as possible. That's exactly why I avoided visiting my parents to discuss anything wedding-related, knowing my sister would be at their house. Whenever my parents wanted to go over wedding details, I specifically asked them to do it over the phone or to visit me instead. On the rare occasions when my fiancé and I did stop by their home, it was actually my parents who brought up the wedding, even though I had no intention of discussing it in front of my sister. But of course, they conveniently left out that part when speaking to her. It must have been easy for them to turn her against me. Even though we had never really had any serious issues in the past, she has always been someone who is easily influenced, and in recent months, I had started to sense that she was developing some resentment toward me. I tried to brush it off, but now it's clear that she has made her choice, and it definitely isn't in my favor. The remainder of her message was focused on how deeply my parents were hurt that I had taken so long to decide whether or not they were even welcome at my wedding. They firmly believed I was making the situation seem far more difficult than it actually was, assuming I was intentionally keeping details from them just to be disrespectful. Once again, my parents acted as though everything revolved around them, as if I had no right to feel anything about their actions unless those emotions were favorable toward them. My sister also mentioned that our parents felt my supposed attempt to embarrass and upset them over something so small was more revealing of my character than theirs. They argued that, at the very least, they had owned up to their actions and expressed regret, while I had never even offered an apology. However, they now claimed they no longer cared to receive an apology from me, as it would be meaningless anyway. The entire thing felt exaggerated, but they even went so far as to say their only real regret was bringing up a daughter who was unable to think beyond financial matters. That statement infuriated me because I couldn't believe they truly thought this was about money rather than their dishonesty. In reality, the financial aspect was never an issue for me. My fiancé and I had no problem affording the wedding we wanted, regardless of whether they contributed or not. What truly upset me was the fact that they weren't honest from the beginning when they knew they wouldn't be able to help. Instead of taking responsibility for how they handled the situation, they twisted the story to paint me as greedy and materialistic. Everyone I have spoken to, my fiancé, his parents, my close friends, agrees that this was never about finances but about honesty and trust. If my parents refuse to acknowledge that, then they don't deserve to be at my wedding. In fact, they don't deserve a place in my life at all. I'm done with them. These past few weeks have been mentally exhausting, and honestly, I feel relieved that they decided not to come to the wedding. Right now, I just want to be surrounded by love and positivity, and that's certainly not what I've been getting from them. In the end, I guess everything turned out for the best. Third update. Yesterday I got married, and thankfully, everything went smoothly without any issues. In 2 days, my husband and I will be heading off on our honeymoon. It still feels strange to call him my husband after referring to him as my fiancé for so long, but I'm sure I'll adjust to it soon. Before I talk about the wedding itself, I want to mention something that recently happened with my family. Thankfully, I have such an amazing support system that it didn't bother me at all. In my previous update, I explained that my family refused to come to my wedding because they were upset that I took time to decide if I even wanted them there. Given everything that had happened, I had every right to take my time, but they clearly didn't respect that. Instead, they chose to cut me off completely. Oddly enough, I felt a sense of relief. Dealing with them had been so draining, and since they were the ones who chose to remove themselves from my life, I thought the chaos was finally over. Unfortunately, I was mistaken.
Just days before the wedding, my parents sent out a group email to all our relatives, including some of my husband's family, with a single sentence: "She is a gold digger, and he is about to ruin his life." Naturally, this caused confusion among many people, but we told everyone to simply ignore it.
It was clearly a petty and bitter attempt to damage my reputation out of spite because they weren't invited. The most surprising part was that they did this so close to the wedding, even though they were the ones who originally refused to attend. Thankfully, my husband and friends handled the situation perfectly. They reassured everyone who received the email that it was nothing but meaningless nonsense and shouldn't be taken seriously. And that's exactly what it was. Completely unimportant. It was nothing more than a desperate last-minute effort to get my attention, but I refused to let them succeed. With the love and support of my husband and my friends, I was able to move on from it almost immediately. Everyone else followed my example and dismissed it without giving it a second thought. I feel incredibly lucky to have such wonderful people in my life who truly care about me, and I couldn't be happier that in just a few days, I'll be off on my honeymoon with my best friend, my husband. I'm officially married now, and as far as I'm concerned, he is the only family I need.